So earlier we discussed these goring new hunting competitions where contestants are basically awarded lots and lots of money for killing coyotes, bobcats, and foxes. And we talked about this idea that obviously this has negative effects on the coyote, bobcat, and fox populations. But what are the potential effects of other species in the ecosystem? Um, and what we're going to do next is basically look at the effects of coyote removal in Texas through this case study. But before we do that, there's a couple key things that I want to cover. Number one is this idea of what's called a keystone species. So a keystone species is a species that essentially has a much, much greater impact on the distribution and abundance of surrounding species than the abundance of that individual keystone species would suggest. And the overall integrity of the whole community depends on that keystone species. And so a great example of that would be a beaver. So a beaver really has a disproportionate effect on the rest of the individuals in that community based on just sort of the population or the number of individual beavers in that community. And that's because these beavers can create these giant beaver dams. And so these beaver dams will block up water and it can create an entire wetland ecosystem. So it can fundamentally change the entire ecosystem. So these beaver lodges will basically create a whole new ecosystem that has effect on a lot of different individuals. And if you were to remove the beavers from that system, the species richness and community composition could change dramatically. So beavers are one great example of this. Another great example of a keystone species are sea otters. So sea otters, as you can see pictured right here, they prey on sea urchins that you can see pictured right here. And as it turns out, sea urchins have a pretty profound effect on kelp forests. And kelp forests are really important habitats for lots of different organisms. And so you can see here, this is a sort of healthy kelp forest that has sea otters. And you can see all the fish swimming around in this kelp forest. And there's lots of other organisms that depend on that kelp. And what happens is these sea otters, because they eat away a lot of these urchins, they keep the sea urchin population in check. And they stop the sea urchins from eating away the kelp forests. When the otters are taken out of the population, these urchin populations can grow disproportionately. They can eat away these seabeds, or the kelp rather, and that influences all of these other species. So just having a few of these otters around can make a huge or disproportionate effect on all of these other species in the population. And so once again, those otters are what's called a keystone species. They have a disproportionate effect on all these other species in the population. And so when we're talking about keystone species, that's really part of this larger issue of the regulation of community structure. And so if we think about a community as a sort of simplified food chain like we see here, you can have this community where there's plants down at the bottom of the food chain. Then there's herbivores like this bunny rabbit that eat the plants and grasses that grow. And then above that herbivore, there's these first or primary level carnivores. These can also be called mesopredators that feed on those herbivores. And then in turn, there can be secondary and even tertiary level carnivores. And these secondary carnivores feed on those mesopredators that feed on the herbivores. And so another way to think about this is a community that's structured by all the populations of these different plants, herbivores, primary or first carnivores or mesopredators, and secondary carnivores. And each of these things represents what's called a trophic level. And trophic, it basically just means eating. So it's the level of eating. And so plants are at the first level, herbivores are at the second trophic level, these mesopredators are at the third trophic level, and these secondary carnivores are at the top of the food chain or the fourth trophic level in the case of this food chain. And so when you talk about the regulation of the community structure, it's basically how does the population and abundance of each of these different trophic levels influence the population and abundance of all the other trophic levels. And you can have different types of regulation. You can have, for example, top-down regulation of populations. And this is essentially where community structure is regulated by the higher trophic levels. So for example, these predators like the hawks and the fox have a strong influence on the number of rabbits and therefore plants that are in the population. And this is in contrast to something called bottom-up regulation, where basically this community structure and the number of hawks and predators and herbivores are determined by these things at the bottom, the amount of plants that are produced in that, or the amount of plants that are present in this community. So it's basically community structure being determined by the amount of resources at these lower trophic levels. So these things, just to be clear, these are not mutually exclusive. You can have populations that have a little bit of top-down regulation and bottom-up regulation simultaneously. They don't have to be just one or the other. Okay, so just as an example to make sure you understand, which does the previous otter example that we used, where the otter controls the kelp beds, is that an example of top-down regulation or bottom-up regulation? Which do you think? All right, if you said top-down regulation, that is right. That's an example of basically a mesopredator of those urchin herbivores community controlling the plant community. So that's top-down regulation. So now that we've got that under our belt, what you're going to do for the rest of the assignment is basically explore the effects of coyote removal in the plains communities of West Texas. So you're going to actually look at an experimental study where they looked at the effects of removing coyote communities and how that affects different predators in the population, herbivores in the population, and even the grass and plant communities in the population. So basically your job is to work sequentially through these activities under the case study. So first you'll read this article, then you'll complete each of these case study quizzes, part 1 through 6, sequentially, and you can work in groups, but you need to submit your answers individually for these case study quizzes, and please submit them by the posted deadlines. Good luck.